As a pastor or a preacher, it's kind of accepted or common practice that when you do what I'm about to do, which is teach a message or preach a sermon on a Sunday morning, you're supposed to come up with some kind of grabber at the front end to get everybody's attention. Otherwise, they're just going to tune you out for the next 35 or 40 minutes and wake up when you pray at the end. That kind of functions like your alarm clock in the morning. I've never understood that, because I kind of figure if you guys don't want to listen, you wouldn't have come, right? But even more to the point, one of the many advantages to preaching Jesus, to teaching directly from the Gospels in the Bible, teaching the words and the actions of Jesus, is you don't have to do any of that. You know why I know that? Because consistently, if you ask Americans, or you can expand it and make it a global question, if you ask them, who is the person that you admire the most? Who is the person that you hold in the highest esteem? The answer is always Jesus. And it's not just Christian people who say that, it's everybody. So I figure, all I got to do is tell you that we're going to act today like the audience 2,000 years ago who were situated on that grassy slope in northern Israel around the Sea of Galilee. And Jesus was situated right about where the camera is. And he sat down and he taught. And he taught this thing that you'll find in Matthew 5, 6, and 7 in the Gospel of Matthew in your New Testament. If you're reading along for the Jesus season, you just finished it. You did chapter 7 this past week. This is perhaps one of Jesus' greatest sermons, and it is one of his most challenging. And in it, as you heard the video say, what Jesus wants to do is draw a contrast. And he tells you this as he wraps the whole thing up toward the end in Matthew 7. He says that what he's doing in this sermon, what he's telling those people that day and us, his listeners today, is that we have a choice to make. We have a choice to make about how we're going to go about life. And there is the wide way, the common way, the accepted and unquestioned way that most people go about life, and then there's his way, his alternative, that is harder, but better, and not that many people find it. And Jesus says the bottom line is that for all those people who just go about life the typical way, it wears them away. And year after year, month after month, decade after decade, their very way of life is like coarse sandpaper upon their soul. And it wears them out in the end. And Jesus that day preached that there is a better way, albeit a harder way. And it is the only way to really find life. Life in all its fullness. Life at its best. What we've done for the last few weeks is that we have looked at little snippets, little verses, single verses usually, from the Sermon on the Mount. Because the way the Sermon on the Mount works is single verses tend to lead into larger sections. So if you look at these single verses that function like theme verses or head verses, you can kind of understand the whole thing. And what you found is Jesus isn't kidding. He is offering a very different perspective on life, what you should value, what you should prioritize, what you should care about For instance, 2 weeks ago we talked about who Jesus said are the really fortunate people in the world, and it's not who you think. It's people like those who mourn, or people like those who are poor in spirit, or people who are hungry spiritually, not satisfied. And last week, Jesus went one step further and said, you know what? Here's how good and true and virtuous you need to be. You need to be better than those leaders around you. It needs to come from the inside out. This is how you need to lead your life. It is the only way for you to find any kind of spiritual satisfaction. And the last 2 Sundays have pretty much covered the entirety of Matthew chapter 5. This week we're actually going to cover the first half of Matthew chapter 6. Because the first half, the first 18 verses of that chapter are really only about one idea. And it's verse 1 of Matthew chapter 6. In which Jesus, the great teacher, says to us, beware of doing your righteousness in front of others, in order to be seen by them. For then you have no reward from your Father in heaven. Righteousness, what's that mean? That's a churchy word. Don't do the good things in your life. Don't do the loving things in your life. Don't do the truthful things in your life. Don't do the spiritual things in your life in front of others in order to be seen, for then you have no reward from your Father in heaven. He then goes on to give 3 examples in the first 18 verses of Matthew 6, and I'd like you to hear those examples the way that his audience 2,000 years ago would have. The first example he gives is about being generous to poor people. And he says, don't be like the people who sound a trumpet when they give to poor people. Now, what's that mean? Well, it's not what you think. There really weren't people who had the absolute gall and audacity to hire a cornet player to stand up and blare an E flat as loud as possible whenever they decided to put $1 in the offering basket when it went by in synagogue. That's not how it worked. A trumpet. What Jesus means is that in the temple in Jerusalem, and that in most large synagogues in decent-sized towns, there were collection bins. And these collection bins were metal. They looked like giant spittoons, although I'm sure if you spit into one, you'd get in all kinds of trouble. They looked like giant spittoons that are about 2/3 my size. And they had a flared top, kind of like a tuba top. And when you either came into the synagogue or you left the synagogue, or you came into the temple or you left the temple, you would put your offering that would go directly to meeting the needs of the poor into these collection bins. Well, if somebody really wanted everyone to look at them, they'd have their big sack of coins. They didn't have folding money in those days. They only had metal coins of some kind. And they'd stand over that trumpet, that opening to the collection bin, and they would open that sack, and you can imagine the racket that was made. And you couldn't help but every eye in the place turn and look at these people when they were giving to the poor. By the way, it also gives new insight into what Jesus was saying in his famous story about the widow and her 2 pennies. Yeah, I bet nobody heard those going in to the brass or copper collection bin. But Jesus said they mattered the most of all. Jesus said, don't do that kind of thing. Then he says, don't pray like the people who stand in the synagogue or stand on the street corners and pray aloud. He probably means, by the way that his audience then would have taken it, he's talking about the religious leaders. The only people who got to pray in the synagogue were people who were religious leaders or were appointed by religious leaders. And they knew all the right ways to pray, and they knew all the right things to say when they prayed. And Jesus says, yeah, don't pray like them. And then Jesus finishes by saying, yeah, okay, you know when you fast, fasting would be abstaining from food and drink in order to be more spiritually focused or attuned. Don't walk around like you're in abject misery because you've gone a few days without eating because you're exercising spiritual discipline. You guys remember the phrase from the Old Testament, if you're familiar with the Bible, that people would weep in sackcloth and ashes? Well, people would do the same thing in Jesus' day when they were fasting. And they would walk around in dirty clothes, or they'd have dirty faces that were streaked with dust, or they'd throw dust in their hair. And they would all do it as part of an outward expression of this inner spiritual discipline that they were exercising. And Jesus said, no, don't do that. In fact, beware of doing spiritual things and good things and loving things to be seen by other people, because there's no reward in it from your Father in heaven. So what's Jesus' point in preaching that day this very simple yet challenging concept? Well, very obviously, Jesus is taking dead aim at being a spiritual show-off. And perhaps if you've been in church, there are some gratuitous, grotesque, egregious things that come to mind to you. Like the guy who, when it's open mic Sunday, is always the first guy to run to the mic because finally the pastor is giving mic time to somebody else and he gets to talk in church. And everybody has to pretend to listen. That guy. Or the guy who, when you're at the prayer meeting, he is always the guy to pray. He's always the person to use the words that you don't understand because you haven't been in church as long as he has. And he seems to really enjoy praying right over everybody's head. Or the person who tends to pray about things in prayer group that really kind of seem like gossip. I'm not so sure you should be talking to anybody about that stuff. But they kind of leak out little secrets. All of those things may or may not be helpful for us as we think about what Jesus meant in Matthew 6:1. You think about the person who makes sure that you know how much they give to the church or how much they helped out somebody else. Okay, I'm sure that all of us, especially us who have been in the church world, we can come up with a list of things like that. Here's the problem. If you leave it at that level and you just point the finger at these really big, grandiose examples of people who were very obviously trying to show off so other people would think a lot of them, you're missing the depth of what Jesus is teaching here. And you're running the danger of something he's already talked about in Matthew chapter 5. Do you remember one of the points that he was trying to get across to his audience about how to live a good life, how to live a true life, how to live a life congruent with God's wishes, is you don't just want to focus on the stuff that only a few people do wrong, like murder or adultery. Jesus said, why don't you focus on hate or lust? And then you find out, we're all kind of in the boat together and we're all trying to swim upstream against what is innate human nature. If we just left this at a place where we were pointing the finger at other people, we would not grasp the fullness of what Jesus is describing. Because really what Jesus describes in Matthew 6:1 applies to all of us, not just a few people who are spiritual showmen. See if somewhere in the next few slides you don't find yourself represented. If you walk around with Matthew 6:1 bouncing around in your head for a while, and you think it through, and you pull it apart, and you try to figure out how it applies to you, not just somebody else, here are some things you might land on. Number one, you will find that many of us, if not all of us to one degree or another, are addicted. And the person who uses that word means it in exactly how you think. We are addicted to other people's approval and or criticism. And as such, it dictates our behavior. Listen to the way that John Ortberg described this in his book, The Life You Always Wanted, which is a book about Christian spiritual habits. And there's an excellent chapter in it on this particular spiritual habit that Jesus is describing, which is called the practice of secrecy. John Ortberg writes, "Some people live in absolute bondage to what other people think of them. The addiction takes many forms. If we find ourselves often getting by on what people say about us, then we probably have it. If we habitually compare ourselves with other people, if we find ourselves getting competitive in the most ordinary of situations, then we probably have it. If we live with a nagging sense that we aren't important enough or special enough, or we get envious of another's success, we probably have it. If we keep trying to impress seemingly important people, we probably have it. If we are worried that someone will think ill of us if they find out that we are an approval addict, yes, we probably have it then too. Like all addicts, we go to great lengths to get a fix when we feel desperate. And like all addicts, we find that there is no fix that lasts forever. So we keep coming back for more and more, over and over again. You don't think this goes on in the Christian world? You don't think this goes on among good Christian people in good churches? It goes on all the time. Where your behavior, what you do, and what you say is driven within by your addiction to needing other people's approval or fearing other people's criticism. It goes on all the time. And Jesus would say to you, beware of living good or living true or doing loving things for those reasons. Because someone else is going to like it or someone else isn't. Because there is no reward from your Father in heaven in that. Here's a similar thing that Jesus is absolutely addressing. And it is something that is not about a few of us. It's about most of us, or all of us. In sociology, there is a thing called the generalized other. What's that? Generalized other is this, as described by John Ortberg in that same book in the same chapter. Our generalized other is a composite of all the Siskells and Eberts in our life, whose thumbs up or thumbs down carry weight with us. But, of course, we never really know for sure the totality of what any person actually thinks about us. The irony of the generalized other is that it's not really about someone else at all. It's what we think other people are thinking about us. It's what we think other people are feeling about us. And most of the time, it is untrue. There probably isn't a person in the room who doesn't have what sociologists would call a conception of the generalized other in their life. And this is what you think other people are going to think about what you do. How you behave, how you talk, how you treat somebody else, who you interact with, who you spend your time with, whatever. And you have an idea of how other people are going to look at that. You have an idea about how other people are going to feel about you when you do that. And Jesus would say, beware of doing your righteousness before other people, because there is no reward in that kind of living. None. Not to mention, you're probably wrong. Your conception of what other people think of you is terribly inaccurate. And the more you think about it and the more you move forward, the closer it's going to get to home. If you were in that audience that day and you heard Jesus say to you, beware of doing the good things or the moral things or the virtuous things or the spiritual things in your life so that other people can see you do it, you would have also had to identify about yourself, I am starving to be recognized. And I dare say there is no one in the room, myself included, who doesn't feel this way. Someone once wrote that when you're in your 20s, you live to please other people. When you're in your 30s, you're tired of trying to please other people. You get mad at other people because you're trying to please other people. And you start trying to live to please yourself. And then in your 40s, you realize nobody was thinking about you at all. You think that's true? Part of what I know I look at today, like Jesus that day, is I look at a room full of people who ache to be recognized. They ache to be appreciated. They ache to be affirmed and encouraged in what they do. And we have to at least admit that that hunger is very pronounced in all of us. I want you to think I do a good job. You want me to think you do a good job. You want me to notice when you make a hard decision or you sacrifice yourself for the sake of somebody else. You want somebody else to pay attention to that, to affirm that. We are all marked by this hunger to be appreciated. And Jesus says to us, beware of doing righteous things to be seen by other people, even if it's driven by that kind of hunger. Be careful, because there is no reward in it. And here's the last thing Jesus' audience would have heard that day. And actually, of all the things I've flashed up here on the screen, this is the one that probably, when people talk about this idea, gets overlooked the most. That day, when Jesus gave his examples of people who were trying to get others to look at the good things they were doing, the people that Jesus was talking about are the religious leaders, the people who were upstanding citizens in their communities, in their synagogues, in their religious circles. They were the rich people who had enough money to make that brass enlarged spittoon ring out when they put a lot of money into it. They were the people who knew how to pray or had the position in the synagogue to stand up and to pray. Not everybody could do that. Do you realize what Jesus was doing in Matthew 6:1? He was speaking to everybody who wasn't one of those people. He was speaking to the proletariat. He was speaking to the everyman. Most of the people in Jesus' audience that day would have been very poor. They would have been living hand to mouth. They would have been nobodies. They would have never gotten the chance to stand up and pray in synagogue. They'd never been listened to, or they'd never been sought out for wise counsel in a difficult situation. They'd have never thought that the little bit of money that they had to give to poor people really mattered at all. And Jesus says, no. In fact, I tell you, you need to beware of what the big wigs and the haves and the special people with the positions need to be careful of the way they go about things. Because I'm telling you, there's no benefit to it. There is no reward in it. There's a better way. There's a quieter way. There's a humbler way. There's a more secret way. And everybody can do it. You don't have to just stand up in church to pray. You can go into an inner place in your house, close the door, and pray. And God sees you there, and he doesn't see the stuff that goes on in church. When you give to the poor, don't drop in a mountain full of money into those brass collection plates. Just go take care of them directly. God sees that. He doesn't see the other thing. When you fast, don't draw attention to your sacrifice and to your stomach pain. No. Jesus was leveling the playing field, and he was saying that being a spiritual or righteous person is accessible to all. You don't have to be special. You don't have to know the right words. You don't have to have other people acknowledge you as some massive paragon of spiritual virtue. You don't. Because really, living a righteous life, living a good life, living a virtuous life is quiet. It flies under the radar, but everybody can do it. So Jesus says, you need to beware of living a life like this. And he says that there is absolutely no reward in it. And those are frightening words. And the more literally you take them, the more frightening they become. Because that means every time any one of us does anything that is really more about me and ingratiating myself to you, or making you think something more of me, and I muddy the waters of what I'm trying to do that's good or for the sake of someone else with all these inner ambitions and motives, Jesus says very bluntly, there is no reward for you in that from the God in heaven. Nothing. I wonder how many prayers have been prayed, how many large checks have been written, how many sermons have been preached, how many stars have taken the stage, and regardless of what it looked like, God was nowhere in the room. Because that's not how God behaves. That's not what God cares about. There is no reward, Jesus says, in that kind of behavior. So here's Jesus' alternative. If that's the normal way, if it is normal to be addicted to how other people view us, if it is normal to be washed over with hunger for approval, if it is normal to center on what other people think of what I do and how I do it, here's what Jesus would rather have us do. 3 times after Matthew 6:1, Jesus says about praying, about giving to the poor, and about fasting, those 3 examples that he uses. He uses almost an exact duplicate phrase or refrain 3 times. And it's his alternative. He says, do your righteousness, whatever it is, to your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Beware of doing your righteous things publicly because there's no reward in it. Instead, here's the better alternative. Do those things in secret to your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. What do you think Jesus is driving at? How is this a far better way to orient your life? How is this a far better way to go about your spiritual life? How does this actually lead to life and not self-destruction? Well, Jesus is absolutely telling all of us that we have one question that we have to keep in mind all the time. And that question is very simply, for whom am I doing this? For whom am I doing this? Let me suggest to you that there are 4 groups of people for whom you do every action in your life. 4. There's God. There's the beneficiary of the action. There are the people who are watching the action. And there's you. Which ones of those 4 groups do you think Jesus says you should be concerned about? For whom do you do good? For whom do you love? For whom do you give? For whom do you pray? Well, of those 4 groups of people, Jesus would have you care about 2. He would have you care about the God who is in every act and who observes every act. And he would have you keep in mind that fundamentally, chiefly, you are doing it for him. For your Father, his phrase is, who is in secret. You know who else he would have you keep in mind? The direct beneficiary of the action. If you are going to give an anonymous gas card to a family, the only 2 people that you need to worry about when you do that are God, who is motivating and observing the act, and the family who receives it. Nobody else. The 2 groups of people that Jesus would say you shouldn't be concerned about ever in any part of your spiritual life are, number 1, the people who are observing you from the outside when you pray or you give or you serve or you minister or you love. Forget about it. Don't worry. They are not part of the equation. And last, don't worry about you. Whatever you're doing, it may seem beneath you, or it may seem like nobody is applauding you or encouraging you. You may not be getting your bang for your buck, for the investment of your time and your energy. Jesus would say it's not about you. It is about the Father who is in secret and you are serving him. And it is about the people that you are serving. It is not about you or the people who are watching you. It's not about that. For whom are you doing this action? Jesus would say to you, you will only find life. You will only find some sense of satisfaction in life. You will only find spiritual fulfillment and intimacy in life if you ask yourself tirelessly, over and over, for whom am I doing this? Next, Jesus would say to you that this kind of secrecy, this commitment to spiritual anonymity, it protects you. And it protects the people around you. No longer are you posturing for what other people will think of you. You're protecting them from thinking too little of you and too much of you. And you're protecting yourself from developing an inflated opinion in the eyes of other people. You're protecting yourself from growing more and more addicted from the need to be approved by other people, or avoiding the criticism of other people. It is only by heeding the words of Jesus and realizing, when I do what's good and I do what's right, I need to ask without fail, for whom am I doing this? And it needs to be about God, and it needs to be about the people that I am directly benefiting, and that's all. When you do that, do you realize how free you become? Completely free. Because you now no longer have to worry about doing something that somebody else doesn't think a lot of. You don't have to worry about somebody else looking down their nose at you for a choice that you make, or a gift that you give, or a way that you pray. No. Secrecy frees you. It frees you to follow God's Spirit's initiative and directives in your life. It frees you to love without concern for what you get back. No. For whom do you do this? And will it free you? Will it free you to be truly involved in what Jesus wants you to be involved in? There is extraordinary power in the perspective of Jesus. That you will do your righteousness aimed directly at your Father who is in secret. And you will trust that your Father who is in secret will reward you for it. And that, by the way, is part of the problem. The reason that all of us have this innate hunger to be encouraged and affirmed and appreciated more than other people can keep up with is because we don't really believe that God, whom we can't see, whom we can't touch, that God is not going to reward us for things that we do humbly and quietly and privately. We don't believe it. I don't. What if you took Jesus up on this challenge? And you said, you know what? I think he's right. I'm certainly wearing myself out the other way, trying to live for the sake of other people and for what they think of me, or how they're going to like me, or how they're not going to like me. And I am just tired of being so hungry for everybody's appreciation. Forget it. I'm willing to try something new. Do you know how that's most of us come to Jesus in a moment like that? We finally decide, that's it. I can't do this on my own. I'm going to listen to him more than I listen to me. What if you did that? And you said, I'm going to start to do the right things. I'm going to start to live my spiritual life in a way that's more humble, more quiet, more in secret. And I am going to believe that everything I do, every small thing, every unnoticed thing, God is going to reward me for that. I don't know how, but it's going to happen. I wonder if you wouldn't find that you would get some of the appreciation and encouragement from people that you didn't even know cared about you if you just left it in God's hands and stopped trying to manipulate it yourself. I wonder what it would look like for us to live this kind of reckless faith that Jesus is advocating. You're going to get a chance at the end of the service to think a little bit more and pray a little bit more about this really, frankly, revolutionary concept that even in Christian circles almost nobody lives by. Where we focus on doing the right things and the loving things for God, for the person that they benefit, and nobody else. But I want to end with this. So think of this contrast that Jesus draws today. He talks about people who do things to be seen or encouraged or appreciated by other people for a variety of reasons. And he talks about his alternative, doing things more privately, more oriented to God, more trusting in God for the outcome. Do you realize, I don't know if you caught it or not, Jesus is actually telling you something about God himself. Did you hear it? Jesus said it 3 times about God, in fact. Which one of those, if we're not careful, do we make God out to be? The one on the left. That God is trying to do these big, bombastic things to get our attention. That God wants somehow, here's the churchy phrase for it, to glorify himself at all times through all things. That somehow God is the great egomaniac of the universe. And he wants all eyes on him at all times. Do you realize that Jesus said 3 times that is not how he works? He said, let me tell you something about God. I want you as a person to live the way that you can observe God himself living. And how does God live? How does God operate? How does God work? He is in secret. Those are the words of Jesus. God's a humble God. God's a quiet God. God does not worry about what you think about what he does, whether you like it or not. God's a secret God. He's a private God. God is exactly what you heard Jesus counsel you about how you go about your life and you do the right and good things in your life. That's how God behaves. Maybe if you and I wanted to find God's activity in our life, we'd have to change where we look. You might want to stop looking at the really, really big things in your life. You may want to stop looking at the grandiose things in your life. You may want to start looking in the shadows and in the quiet, because that's where Jesus says that God operates. He's in secret, because he's a kind and humble God who doesn't care about getting all the attention, just like he advises us to be. And what I'm telling you is, the more and more that you think about that conception of God, the more you realize, oh, that's why he wants us to live the way that Jesus said. Because in the end, in the verse right before the one that we talked about today, Jesus says, be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. Translation, just live the way God does, and you will find life like you never thought you could. For your Father is in secret, and so should you be too. Would you pray with me?